Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Our next report comes from Yorkshire and a wonderful lady called Pat. Pat actually writes crime books for anybody that's interested, and I can always put you in touch with Pat. But these are some reports that happened to her and her family members when she was growing up. She said, I must say, I've listened to some of your podcasts recently and I'm amazed how many of the experiences that are shared correspond with my interests and experiences. I've enjoyed them immensely, and I'll give you a potted history of my experiences with the paranormal and how a huge gap in experiences occurred due to the willful closing down at the age of 11. Lots of people ask me about that. It is possible. Anything can shut you down, really. You can do it by will, but fear will do it. Any very strong emotion can switch off, shut down people with abilities. I think most children have them, and the switching off happens 8, 9, 10 years of age. But let's get back to Pat. Pat said, my first known experience would have been around the age of 7 or 8, and it took place where my family lived, in a council house on an ordinary estate in Halifax, West Yorkshire. It was a pokey property, just 2 medium-sized bedrooms and a box room, which housed my only brother. My 3 sisters shared the middle room with me. 2 of them were older and 1 younger. The older ones stayed up later, while my younger sister and I went to bed about 9 p.m. One winter's night, I found it difficult to sleep, as my younger sister, about 3 at the time, she seemed to be having nightmares. She was tossing around and muttering in her sleep, and I was getting well teed off in the next bed. So I did something I rarely did, which was turn to face the wall. Doing this always creeped me out for some reason, so I never did it willingly, and it usually only happened as a result of me waking up in that position. The reason I hated it so much was the fact that the light from the landing shone straight onto the wall and would kick up all manner of shadows, depending on how my bedding peaked and troughed. This night, what I saw was no shadow. I saw what I thought was a hand coming through the wall, followed by an arm, followed by a shoulder, and at that point, I buried my head under the covers, fearing what would come next. I was shaking and sweating and feeling ill, and then I began to feel my bed covers move, and they were being pulled off with such force. I didn't have enough strength to hold on to them, and as much as I didn't want to, I opened my eyes, and that was when I saw my first full apparition. An old man was just standing there in the middle of the room. He was wearing a shirt with what I now know to be a false collar, and he was wearing an old-fashioned black suit and the shiniest shoes that I've ever seen. He had a smirk on his face, and his hand moved towards his chest. Either I hadn't noticed before, or it had appeared without me realising, but I could see there was something large and glittery that hung around his neck. And this is what he was holding on to. I had no idea what it was, nor what he wanted. And just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. Many years later, I found out that this was the home of the old mayor of the borough. And that was the beginning of 3 years of hell for me. Not wanting to go to bed when I should, sticking to adults like glue, running in my parents' room at night when he appeared and insisting I sleep with them. It was the only place I felt safe. And as you can imagine, it didn't go down well 60 years ago when attitudes were completely different. That persisted for the next 3 years until I heard my mum and my dad having a conversation about taking me to the doctors. I took my comic to the bedroom to read, and it was a Sunday morning. It was a beautiful sunny day. And as I read, I noticed something over my right shoulder, and I was horror-stricken to see that now familiar arm. And this was the first time it had happened in the daytime. As I thought of all the nights of terror I'd endured, something just snapped. I was 11 years old, and the red mist just descended. As I screamed and shouted at the arm, it became frozen in its tracks. I was basically telling it to F off and all manner of other swear words. I ended up by saying I never wanted to see it again. And it worked, as I never did see it or him again. I think I basically shut off that stream of consciousness by instinct because nobody else knew about the experience. So there was no one to give me any advice. I hadn't spoken to anybody about it. Apart from the odd occurrence in my teens, one of which was even more terrifying. And even though it was a shared experience, I remained spirit-free basically until 40 years later. There is one more recent experience that I had that is hard to explain. I assume what I saw would be classed as a shadow man, but I'm not sure if that's correct. On the 20th of November 2010, my sister and I went to the Sage in Gateshead to see Mary Chapin Carpenter on tour. As we live in West Yorkshire, that meant travelling down the M1 and the A1 to get home. The performance ended very late, well after 11 p.m. And as I was the only driver at the time, I wanted to get home rather quickly before tiredness crept in. I couldn't believe my luck with the traffic, and there was hardly any. And as I'd recently acquired a new sporty type car, and the weather was brilliant for the time of year, I decided to open her up a little bit and see what she could do. We reached an unlit section somewhere between Wetherby and Leeds, and on the left there was an odd few buildings. On the right, over the northbound side, was what looked like a retaining wall. It looked as though the road had been cut through the side of the hill. My sister was faffing around with the new CD that we'd bought at the Stage, which made me glance over to the passenger side that she was sitting. Outside her window was completely black, even though we had plenty of light being given off by the waxing gibbous moon. I began to feel very twitchy. I checked my speedo. I was doing 90 on the inside lane, and there were no other cars in sight anywhere. We were completely alone, something I've never experienced anywhere along that road before. I blinked, I looked through her window again, and it was still completely black. Suddenly there was a movement. As we emerged from a slight bend in the road, this tall, dark figure, he was shaped like a man, ran past me, going at an amazing speed, as I was still doing 90 miles an hour at that point. He ran until he was a few yards in front of me, and then he shot across the road. I automatically swerved the car into the outside lane like you do when you see something human-shaped in front of you. But this time, it was disappearing into a small wall opposite. After my sister made the comment, "What the was that?" I was tempted to pull the car back onto the hard shoulder just to recover. But then my thought was, what if the bloody thing comes back? So I pulled back into the slow lane, but I kept my speed up. I asked my sister what she'd seen, and she described it the same way as me, but she only spotted it once it had begun to run across the road. I swear it was blacker than black. We discussed it again today, and it was definitely not the play of any car headlights or even the moon. It wasn't a shadow. It was what it was, and we know what we saw. She said, "I had an experience in my teens that still puzzles me, if you want to know about it, Deb." So of course I said, I'm happy to take whatever report you're prepared to give me, Pat. So even after this podcast, there will be some further reports coming from Pat. But this is something that happened when she was 14. And I think this ties into the theory that we have that, experiences like these happen and run within families. This is the South Kirby Green Man. When I was 14, my parents allowed myself, my younger sister Julie, and my friend Joyce to travel to my elder sister June's house in South Kirby. It's a little mining village near Doncaster. The idea was we'd stay a couple of weeks during the school holidays, just to give us something to do, really. The first night we stayed over, Joyce and I stayed up fairly late with June. We were nattering away until the early hours, which we were able to do because my brother-in-law was on the night shift down the pit. We went to bed around 2:30 a.m. and we were sharing a quite big double bedroom with my niece Lynn. Joyce and I took Lynn's bed by the window while she topped and tailed with Julie in a put-you-up by the door. June had the master bedroom at the front and my nephew Doug the small back bedroom. All the bedrooms opened onto an uncarpeted small landing which held the wooden stairs leading down to the ground floor entryway. You'll understand why I've described the layout later in the story. As my friend and I lay awake talking about what we would be doing later that day, we both heard some weird noises. A kind of strange chinking sound, like metal on metal, like someone eating out of a tin. I have no idea how to describe the noise, but it carried on for quite some time, along with a couple of creaks of wood, as if someone was walking around. Eventually, we ignored it and we fell asleep. That evening, Joyce and I went to the local youth club for the night, and eventually getting back around 10 p.m. The three of us had a fish and chip supper, and then we played cards until about 1:30 in the morning. June went to bed first, leaving Joyce and I to finish our ablutions in the downstairs bathroom. As a joke, I turned the light off on her, but she began to freak out and I turned it back on. For some reason, we both felt a bit jumpy, so we hurried to finish off and get to bed. I let Joyce lead the way upstairs, and I brought up the rear, turning off all the lights and closing each door behind me. We got settled in, but I noticed both of the young ones in the beds beside us began rambling and thrashing about, as though they were sharing a bad dream. Then the noises began again, much louder than the night before. The chinks of the night before became clangs and creaks. The heavy footsteps that sounded really loud, even though we got the door closed, continued. The temperature in the usually toasty warm room plummeted and it got really cold really quickly. We could see our breath, even though it was the height of summer. The younger kids were still tossing and turning and their mumblings got louder, as though to drown out the approaching sound. At this point, Joyce and I shot under the covers. We were both divering with fear as we followed the sound of the footsteps to our door. There was a short pause where we heard no noise, and I was so grateful for that because I was suffocating. I sat up. Suddenly, something hit the door so hard it sounded as though it had splintered the wood around the handle. The door hit the inbuilt doorstop twice before coming to rest in an open position. I was frozen in fear. My teeth were literally chattering. Joyce was still under the covers, shaking with fear. I watched, wide-eyed, as I noticed a mist that was rising from the floor at the side of the young one's bed. Now, they were now completely silent. They weren't rumbling, they weren't saying anything, and they weren't tossing and turning. That mist rose up, swirling around, changing in both shape, colour and form. All of a sudden, it looked as though it had been sucked into a shape. There, facing us, as clear as day, was a green man. He stood stock still, as though he was intent on staring out of the window. He was old, thin, bald, and wrinkled. His arms were really thin, and it was creased around the neck of the shirt. You could see where it hung off him. He did have wrinkled trousers. They were kept in place by a belt pulled so tight it wrinkled the material. I couldn't tell you what colour his clothes were because everything looked a pale, slimy green colour. Anything of his footwear we couldn't see. They were hidden. I could see every minute detail about him in that moment though. I think I could have counted the hairs of his scruffy whisker given long enough. And then he began to move and I realised that I couldn't. He moved his body slowly, turning slightly so he was now facing us directly. I had no idea that Joyce had resurfaced or when she'd even done that. He tilted his head down. Until then, he just looked like a staring man with a blank facial expression. He looked me straight in the eye and his face morphed into the most evil grinning sneer that I've ever seen. It was hideous and insidious. It was as though he was reaching right into my mind, trying to somehow fix his image there forever. He was taunting us, of that I have no doubt. The evil just dripped off him. His soul was just evil. He finished his performance by laughing at us, his mouth open, eyes looking up, shoulders moving, yet emitting no sound. In a way, That made it worse. And then he faded away to nothing. I sat still for what seemed like hours, and then something in my mind seemed to snap. I took a deep breath and screamed, the most blood-curdling one that I could muster, or at least I thought I had. I jumped straight over the other bed and I ran, still screaming, into June's bedroom, so grateful she still had her light on. She was sitting, calm as you like, winding her alarm clock. I must have looked different because she asked me if I was all right. And then I felt Joyce close in behind me. And I said, no, we weren't bloody okay. And hadn't she heard me screaming blue murder? And she said, no, she'd not heard anything. The last thing she heard was us coming up to bed about 5 minutes after she did. Well, I said, well, we're not going back in that room. But Joyce just seemed mute. Her eyes were wide and glazed with fear. June didn't seem at all concerned. She just suggested we all go downstairs for a cuppa. I don't know if it was by accident or design, but she led the way, and I'm glad she did, because none of us could believe what we saw. She opened the front door from the little hallway into the living room, and it looked as though there'd been a break-in. The first thing June did was check both outside doors. Both had mortise and yale locks still in place, and there were no signs of forced entry being used. Every light downstairs was on, and every door was open, even the bathroom. Things were moved around in the kitchen, chairs were out of place, and the flap on the old kitchen unit was down. Crockery and plates were on every countertop. The front room looked as though a bomb had gone off in it. A heavy fire guard had been tipped over, newspapers were scattered everywhere, heavy furniture had been moved position, and the cushions had just been tossed aside. And it was only when she saw the scattered birdseed that June panicked. The cover had been pulled off the cage and thrown across the room, and there were feathers everywhere. We got upset when we couldn't see the budger, but when June looked, he was sitting in the bottom of his cage, dithering. The poor bugger was missing a good portion of his feathers and was obviously scared nearly to death. We thought the bad stuff was at an end for the night. How wrong could we be? After a quick clean-up, we sat down for a cuppa. I asked June if she'd had weird stuff happen in the house before tonight, and she said she had. But she'd always put it down to the kids messing about. And then we heard the noise of the footsteps begin again. They went from the first step, past the very creaky fourth step, up onto the landing, and at this point, it got real for my older sister. I think she was fearing for the safety of her children. She took the stairs 2 at a time, but she found nothing. We still insisted that we were not going upstairs, so we began to play board games. I think Joyce was just still out of it though. A little while later, we heard footsteps coming down, and it was Julie, and she was looking and acting really weird. We asked if she was all right, but she kept repeating, "The old man keeps waking me up," over and over again. Someone made a remark about not having time to do something, and Julie asked, "What's time?" Not what is the time, but what is time? She had no idea of the concept that she owned a watch, and at that point, I decided to take her home as soon as possible. As it was beginning to get light, June tried to persuade us all to go back to bed, but we didn't want to go up there, despite the fact that she'd said she'd leave the light on and leave all the doors open. And then she came up with the idea of banking up the coal shovel on the 4th step, and that's where the coal hole was. And then she had a good rest the shovel against it, and if anyone came up the stairs and stood on the creaky step, the whole lot would slide and we'd hear it. Seemed like a reasonable plan, so we agreed. We hadn't been back in bed more than 5 minutes when the footsteps started again. And then we heard the racket made by the metal shovel and the sliding coal as it moved. We moved so fast we were in June's bedroom before the footsteps could get to the top of the stairs. We were washed, dressed, packed and outside waiting for 7 a.m. to come, along with the first bus to Wakefield. It took Julie many months to recover from her experience. Joyce still slept with the light on until just a few months ago, and we are now in our mid-60s. That's how much it had an effect on us. Here are a few extras about the house that you might find interesting. My sister June's experiences continue to get worse. My brother-in-law left his job after having an encounter with something while he was alone in the house after an afternoon shift. He got a taxi from South Kirby to Halifax, where June and the kids were visiting, and he stayed there with them. They never lived in that house again. The next door neighbour related to them the story of a newly married couple who came to view the house. When looking at it, the wife refused to go inside. She said she wouldn't cross the threshold. I'd like to thank Pat for sharing those experiences with me. Absolutely wonderful, and of course I will be bringing you more as the